All right, good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I think there's going to be a few more folks coming in, but that should be all right. Welcome to the Hampton History Museum. My name is Chris Peters. I run the educational programming here. And I'm going to take some time this afternoon to talk about the Battle of Hampton and really why it happened. It isn't just about the battle itself. You could hours diving into this one encounter, and during the battle, but that's not going to be my focus. As my buddy Randy would say, we're going to connect the dots. We're going to show why this happened. We're going to show the lead up to it. There's a lot of things going on in Virginia in the spring and summer of 1775, and my objective right now is to bring all of that together and explain why some of the first fighting outside of New England happened a couple hundred yards over there in the Hampton River. And that's a really important part of this. In the summer of 1775 and into the fall, there really isn't an American. There's a rebellion going on up outside of Boston between ragtag militia force and the British Navy and some small regiments or parts of regiments of the British Army. There's not really a full-blown revolution happening yet. This is going to be some of the first fighting that takes place outside of New England. And it's not necessarily going to bring the revolution into the South. There'll be some isolated fighting going on here, but it's just important because of what it means for Virginia. And that's what we're going to really dive into today. All right, so as we go through this, you're going to see a mix of some modern images and some historic ones. The one that I have up on the screen right now was done by a Frenchman during the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. It's really illustrative for us because it's a good representation of some of the people that were here at the beginning of the war. We'll go from right to left here. The fellow wearing blue with that weird stick in his hand, he's an artilleryman. So the stick he's holding is called a linstock, and he has a powder horn on his side because he's responsible for priming the back of a cannon and igniting it. And that stick has a piece of burning rope on it. So he's an artilleryman. This is how a lot of the British sailors on the ships that were here would have been equipped, because the British ships that I'm going to be talking about have artillery on them, and that means you have to have the linstock to set off those guns, and you've got to have for priming them. Next to him, the guy with the green hat on is a rifleman. And that'll be particularly important for us during the Battle of Hampton because there were actually a bunch of riflemen here. And we'll talk about the importance of them and the role that they played. But he's dressed differently from the rest of these guys. When we look at the other figures in this image, they are wearing formal military uniforms. And in the 18th century, a military uniform would have had different colors on it. The body is going to be one color, and then what they call the facings, which are kind of a turned back part of the coat, are a different color. And the color combinations help tell what regiment you're from and which army you're in. A lot of the guys from Virginia are frequently wearing brown, like the next guy in line here. Brown with red facings is really common. It's not universal, but it's really common for a lot of the troops here in Virginia. The gentleman on the end with the weird hat on with the feathers in it, he is a member of the Rhode Island Regiment. Not present, but there is an equivalent we'll be talking about. So he's a member of the Rhode Island Regiment. His uniform is kind of based on what the French would be wearing. They wore a lot of white and pale colors. But going back to the rifleman, his equipment and his dress is totally different. Instead of a tricorn or bicorn hat, he has on a round hat. And he's not wearing a military uniform, he's wearing a hunting shirt like the one that I have hanging off of the tripod here on the stage. That is not a military garment, that's a civilian garment. This is something that you wear when you go out into the woods to go hunting. That's why it's called a hunting shirt. It's going to become a very iconic piece of clothing here in coastal Virginia during the events that we're about to discuss. And so this image from the end of the war really helps us identify some of the people that would have been here at the beginning, or at least what they looked like. Now, in order to understand what was happening in Virginia, the first thing we have to do is really look at the demographics of Virginia, because it was a very big colony. In fact, it's the largest colony by population. Just going through the numbers, in Virginia at the beginning of the Revolution, there are over 500,000. It's about 525,000 people that we can identify living in Virginia. That does not include any of the native people that aren't being counted in their rosters at the time. So at least 525,000 colonists living in Virginia. And the next in line would be Pennsylvania. They have just over 300,000 people. So that shows you the scale and difference between Pennsylvania and Virginia, from a little over 300,000 to 525. So that's a pretty significant number difference. But Virginia is the largest colony by population. It is also the wealthiest. And that's because you've got a lot of large tobacco plantations down here that have been in operation for decades, if not over a century at this point. You've got lots of large plantations in the Piedmont and some smaller tobacco plantations down here on the coast. And then you get to the Shenandoah Valley, which is a little bit different. Most of the people living in the Shenandoah Valley are operating farms that are much smaller in scale, and they focus on producing food and not tobacco. So the Shenandoah Valley is a little bit different, and that'll play into this as well. But Virginia is the largest, it's the oldest colony, and it's the wealthiest. Because of all those things, it's also one of the most loyal. Nobody who came here in 1774 or 75 would have ever guessed that Virginia would rebel. In fact, part of our name in Virginia, the Old Dominion, this comes from the English Civil War. Virginia was one of the oldest and most loyal of the territories of Britain in the 1650s. So our loyalty to the crown is part of how we become the Old Dominion. And so nobody would have ever thought that we would join this upstart rebellion that's going on unless they were looking a little bit closer at what was happening in 1775 itself. And so Virginia makes most of this wealth by exporting tobacco and then natural resources, wood and wood byproducts, anything that can be harvested off the land or byproducts that come from it. And this would include stuff like pine pitch and pine tar, turpentine, any kind of byproduct that you can make from the natural resources here. Sassafras root and sassafras oil, which is used for medicinal purposes and as a fragrance. So they're sending back anything that they can find here from the natural resources that are available, and then lots of agricultural stuff, not just the tobacco. They're also trading a lot of food to the Caribbean islands. Pork and beef are being grazed in this area and then packed up and shipped off to the islands in the Caribbean. They are also shipping lots of hemp and flax out in the form of rope or other naval stores, also going down to the islands. And then you've got what they called the Indian trade in the 18th century, and this is mostly going to be furs. So today when we think about the fur trade, we often think of white pioneers or white mountain men who would go out into the far west and with their hawk and rifles and go try to hunt or trap game and send those furs back. The reality is, even at that point, they were largely traders lived in the interior, and in this time period even more so. So up around the Great Lakes, the Iroquois have huge access to beaver and otter pelts. You go southwest from here, the Cherokee have access to a lot of deer. The English are trading to get those hides with all the same kind of household goods and weapons and tools that they use here in the colony. So all the same manufactured goods that they import for their own use are being utilized as a trade item to be given to the native people in exchange for hides and furs. And that's big business. There's a lot of trade coming through the Chesapeake Bay because there's so many ports here. There's 5 official ports in Virginia where these hides and furs, tobacco, pork, beef, and all these other products that they're shipping out can be inspected and loaded up and signed off for its voyage across the Atlantic Ocean or to the Caribbean. And Hampton is one of those ports. So that means that somewhere, depending on the time period in the colonial era, somewhere between anywhere from about 20 to 30% of all the goods that are coming in and out of Virginia pass through this port right here. And that makes it very important for the economy.
Did you know tobacco was bad for your health?
They did, and if you go all the way back to the beginning, King James railed against the use of tobacco. He hated the stuff, but it was still very popular throughout Europe, and that was the #1 cash crop coming out of Virginia. When you look at the economy of colonial Virginia over the decades, you can watch it escalate and crash time and again as the price of tobacco goes up and down on the European market, because it is the #1 thing that they export out of this colony. But they did, to at least some degree, understand some of the health implications of that as well. Now, the colonists are importing lots of manufactured goods that they need for everyday life here, and some of that is being used in the Indian trade, but most of it is being used by the colonists themselves. It's their only source for most of these manufactured goods. If you want tools for working your farm, if you want household goods like candlesticks and tableware and cookware, clothing, almost everything that you use on a daily basis here in colonial Virginia has to be brought in on ships. And for most of the colonial era, by law, pretty much all of it has to come through a British trade company. And so that's another part of the loyalty here. There's a lot of merchants in Hampton Roads that make their fortunes off of this trade that goes in and out. They have very reliable and very predictable trade partners, and they can see what's going to happen with the markets. They understand the economy very well because they're the ones that are the most directly engaged with all these goods that are passing through in one direction or the other. Now, the labor in Virginia, about 40% of the population in Virginia, out of that 525 plus, are enslaved. I mentioned the Shenandoah Valley. They purposefully wanted family farmers to populate the Shenandoah Valley to create a buffer zone between the large tobacco plantations in Tidewater and Piedmont, Virginia, because if you've got lots of enslaved people living in the Shenandoah Valley, folks from the Piedmont or the Tidewater might be able to sneak through and have protection on their way to the frontier. If there's basically no slave population in the Shenandoah Valley, that would be a lot harder to accomplish. So they did this by design and brought in lots of Irish, Scottish, and German farmers to populate the Shenandoah Valley. You can still see lots of evidence of that today in the family names that are there and the town names and everything else in the Shenandoah Valley really reflects that this is what they were doing in the 18th century. Well, that means that when you get out of the Shenandoah Valley, around 50% of the population down here in Tidewater and Piedmont, Virginia, is enslaved. That's a pretty big issue when half of the population is being oppressed by the other half of the population, and the white population of Virginia lived in this concern over the possibility of slave rebellions taking place in Virginia. Now, there were no major slave revolts that we're aware of that took place in the colonial era here in Virginia. There were some smaller scale ones at the end of the 17th century, but there were some large scale slave revolts or rebellions in other southern colonies. So this is not something that was just a fantasy on their part. This is something that did happen in other places. So they live with this very real possibility all the time in Virginia where half the population is being enslaved by the other half of the population down here in the Tidewater. And so we have to look at these demographics to explain what's about to happen. So this plays a big part in this. Because of the way that the slave laws had developed in Virginia, there are also almost no free blacks in Virginia on the eve of the Revolution. Now there are some, you can't say there are none, but it's less than 1,000 as far as we can tell out of a population of over 500. So 525 plus 1,000 of them we believe are free blacks. And then, actually, yeah, I'll mention him real briefly. So another part of what's going on here has to do with the governor, John Murray, the Earl of Dunmore. So he's a Scottish nobleman from the Highlands, and he is the royal governor of Virginia. He is the last royal governor of Virginia. And he had been the governor of New York. That was the post that he wanted. And then he got moved down here in 71. So from 71 to 75, he's here in Virginia. He's interested in land speculation. He's interested in the fur trade. That was why he wanted to be in New York. And he is going to end up at odds frequently with the House of Burgesses, which today we call the Virginia Assembly. It is the oldest elected representative body in North America. Started meeting at Jamestown in 1619. Good part of the reason that the revolution is possible in the first place, because once the Virginia Assembly was established here in the summer of 1619, the other colonies, as they developed, copied this system, and by the time you get to the American Revolution, you have two parallel governments. You have the one appointed by the Crown, and then you've got the one elected by the local landowners. Now, of course, who can own land in Virginia? You have to be white, man who owns land. Has to be all three of those things in order for you to have this vote. And so you're going to see him butt heads pretty regularly with the elected assembly here in Virginia. He dissolves them in the summer of 74 because he wants to go off into the frontier and take land from the native people so that he can then sell that to incoming colonies because he's a land speculator. And instead of supporting him and giving him control of the militia, they vote to support Boston instead. And then he dissolves the House of Burgesses. And they're like, well, you know what? We're elected. And they go down the street to Raleigh's Tavern and they reconvene themselves. And they're going to do this again and again and again because as far as they're concerned, it's none of his business. They were elected by the landowners here. That's where their power comes from. Reconvene themselves. He goes off and does his expedition into what's now Ohio. Today we refer to it as Dunmore War. Comes back thinking he'll be hailed as some sort of hero for adding land to Virginia because it is a successful campaign. But instead he's mostly maligned by the people here because, well, he usurped power over the militia and marched off against our will. The militia is operated by the assembly, not the crown. And we'll come back to that again later on. So this guy is going to play a pretty important role in a lot of these events in 1775. Now, I just mentioned the militia. So when we talk about militias today, there's a lot of terminology that kind of gets misused in the modern era. Especially over the last few years, the term militia has come to have this very specific meaning in the United States, and that's not really what a militia is. We frequently call militias today, we should really be calling private paramilitary clubs, because a militia is controlled by a civic body. That's what makes it a militia. The militia is the full body of the combat population who are raised and given orders by some sort of government agency. So the way that this is meant to work in the colonial era is every white male in Virginia between the ages of 16 and 60, and this varies a little bit depending on the time period, but basically 16 to 60, is expected to have a firearm and all of the accoutrements that are required to make it function. Now, the regulations will vary depending on the time period. At times you have to have a musket and a sword and a helmet, or you have to have a musket with a matching bayonet. If you're a rifleman, and this one comes in just before the American Revolution, you have to have a long knife or even a sword as your backup weapon, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But those militia regulations say that every white male between the ages of 16 and 60 has to turn out upon request by the government for military service. Dunmore takes a bunch of these guys who mostly volunteered for this out into the frontier for his campaign in 74. In the spring of 75, now the Virginia Assembly, which has reconvened itself as the Virginia Convention, are reorganizing that militia system and trying to bring it back under their control. They don't want Dunmore to have access to the militia as it exists. They want to maintain control of that themselves. And that's the way it was designed to function in the first place. So they're really just trying to reinforce the way that their role is supposed to work under the existing system. They're not doing anything that's rebellious at this point. They are simply trying to get the system to function the way they understand it should be working. And so in March of 75, at the Second Virginia Convention, They have a vote, and this one takes place up in Richmond, to reorganize the militia under their control and take it away and remove it from even the possibility that Dunmore would be able to do this again. Now, the way that they're reorganizing this, they're going to break it into two different groups. You're going to have independent companies, and the independent companies are organized by local government agencies. So each county is going to have either an independent company or a minute company or both. And the minute companies, which if you go to New England, they're usually called Minutemen, are meant to be kind of a rapid response force. They can hit the field very quickly with all of their equipment. They keep it at the ready most of the time. The independent companies will take a little bit more time to organize, but they are the ones that are meant to be the main line of your troops. So they're the ones that will have a musket and a bayonet and all of the accoutrements that go with this battlefield weapon, whereas a lot of the minute companies will be fitted out the way we see the guys in this image. So this is a modern interpretive image done by an artist named Don Triani who lives up in Pennsylvania. And it shows a bunch of militiamen. These are supposed to be Daniel Morgan's riflemen. And they are not carrying muskets. And the way that you can tell the difference is the end of it. So on a military weapon like this musket, there's bare barrel at the end of it because you have to have a place for this bayonet to slide on and lock in place. They're carrying hunting rifles. They have powder horns full of gunpowder and hunting pouches. They have different equipment. These riflemen are a usable military force, but they don't have the weapons that you would want on the main battlefield. It takes a lot longer to load those rifles. They're not designed for combat. They're hunting weapons. And so you got the minute companies and the independent companies being formed up in the spring of '75. A lot of the guys from the back country, which today the term we would use is frontier. So these are guys that live in the western Piedmont or out in the Shenandoah Valley. These are not the guys that live down here on the coast. They're the ones that mostly have rifles because a lot of these guys put food on the table throughout the year by going hunting. And then they're supplementing their income by harvesting the hides that they get from the hunting and adding that into the export goods headed out of the colony. So they have hunting rifles for the most part instead of muskets, or some of these guys, if they have the resources for it, will have both. Now you can also see most of these guys, actually I think pretty much everybody in this image, is wearing one of these hunting shirts. They're not all made the same. This is not something where they had a pattern and they were all made in the same shop or anything like that. And of course, there's no factories as we would understand them. These are homemade garments. You go into a mercantile shop somewhere and you get a bolt of fabric, and this is just coarse linen or canvas, and then you're going to stitch this thing together at home. It's just a garment that's meant to keep your clothing clean when you're out hunting. So you can go crashing through the bushes and it's going to tear up your hunting shirt instead of ruining your good clothing, which is more expensive. And so everybody's is a little bit different. Later in the war, there will be some mass production of these garments, so you'll see more uniformity to them. But at the beginning of the war, everybody's making their own for the most part. All right, we'll really briefly mention this guy. The way that I have this set up is for a slightly different program. William Legge, the Earl of Dartmouth, and yes, this is the guy that Dartmouth College is named after. He was one of the main funders of it when it was opened. He is the Secretary of State for the colonies. He's one of the people that talks to Dunmore most frequently. He sent out a letter in December of '74, January of '75, telling royal governors to start securing gunpowder and weapons. And that's going to come up again later on. So that's the important thing for him. Now, that letter, which is sent off to the various colonial governors appointed by the crown, or sometimes he's the one making these recommendations, sends the letter off to Parliament or the king saying, here's the person that should be the governor. He's in that kind of position. But this letter that he sends out, somehow a copy of it or at least knowledge of what was in the letter becomes public. And it's actually printed in the newspapers. So the newspaper that I have up on the screen right now is from January of 1775, And in the section here that says Newport, so this was news out of Newport, Rhode Island, there is actually a little section in there that says Lord Dartmouth sent out this letter telling governors to start securing gunpowder and weapons and to not import any more. And that mostly means cutting off trade with Ireland, which is where a lot of the gunpowder was being produced at the time. And so this little excerpt in the newspaper means this is public knowledge. So this thing that was meant to be kind of an internal memo becomes public knowledge to everybody, and it's being published in the newspapers down here. The Virginia Gazette is published in Williamsburg. So this is how widely spread this news becomes. Well, that's exactly what the British tried to do in Massachusetts at the end of April 1775. So this is why we end up with the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 75. The British march on the colonial arsenals, for lack of a better term, where they're storing lots of weapons and gunpowder with the intention of taking those supplies. And up there, they are turned back. So these are the first shots of the revolution, the way we always describe it today. And this is another modern image that we're looking at, although years old. So this is something that, of course, we've been talking about for very. Same thing happens here in Virginia, but we call it the gunpowder incident. So in the middle of the night, 2 days later, and this really makes me think that the letter that Lord Dartmouth sent out, which I have not been able to find a copy of, so if anybody knows where I can actually read that letter, I would love to hear about it, because this makes me think that the letter may have had instructions on when they should be doing this. It seems like a little too much of a coincidence that they march on Lexington and Concord on April 19th, and then Dunmore does the same thing here on April 21st. But Dunmore sends a bunch of guys from a small schooner like the one that you see up on the screen here called the HMS Magdalen up. It's tied up over at Jamestown. They go up with a wagon from Jamestown into the middle of Williamsburg, and they take about 15 half barrels of gunpowder. And I ran the numbers on this, and for the cartridges for these Brown Bess muskets, like the one that I have up here, this is enough gunpowder to make somewhere around 150,000 rounds of ammunition. So this is a substantial amount of gunpowder that they successfully take out of the magazine in the middle of the night. They load it in their wagon, they go back down to their ship, they get it loaded on the ship, and nobody stops them. So whereas this becomes the battles of Lexington and Concord up in Massachusetts, down here, Lord Dunmore was successful at doing this. Now, within a couple of hours, everybody in Williamsburg knows what has happened, and a mob with torches and pitchforks marches on the governor's house. So if you've ever visited Colonial Williamsburg, that big fancy house that we call the governor's palace, that's where Lord Dunmore would have been living, and green outside, hundreds, if not 1,000 or more, people show up on the green in the wee hours of the morning, like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, with torches and pitchforks in hand. Literally, these guys are armed, and they say, you need to put that gunpowder. It doesn't belong to the crown. It was paid for by the assembly. So we're going to, again, see this conflict between what the crown may be in control of and what the colonists themselves claim power over. And so they tell Dunmore, you need to put that powder back. Well, he is going to make up an excuse pretty much on the spot and say, I heard there was going to be a slave rebellion, and I took the gunpowder to keep it safe. Now, they live under this constant concern that this kind of thing could happen, so he gets away with it, at least for a little while. He then makes the mistake of going and telling other people that he's friends with in the town that he made that up. So within hours of this event, he gets them calmed down and disperses the crowd, and he successfully navigates this mob on his front porch. But then he lets slip what he's doing, and within hours of that, the whole town knows that this was a ruse. So this is going to go back and forth, up and down quite a bit as we progress here. But he sends a letter off to Lord Dartmouth where he says that he made this up. These guys are in constant correspondence. This is basically Lord Dunmore's boss. The building that you see up on the screen now is the magazine at Williamsburg, and both of the buildings I've just shown you are reproductions. There are very few buildings up at Colonial Williamsburg that are original to the 18th century. Most of it has been reconstructed, largely in the first half, or I guess the middle of the 20th century, although they're still doing work up there now. They're constantly updating buildings, doing restoration work to the original ones and reconstructing ones that don't exist anymore. So it's an ongoing project, but that's the building that they would have taken the powder out of. And another excerpt up on the screen where he's kind of letting slip what's going on. He's telling his friends or Lord Dartmouth or other people what's going on. And he doesn't hold back because these are personal letters or correspondence that's not really supposed to be seen by anybody else. So there's no reason for him to maintain the ruse here. Now we get into the standoff because he has taken something that belongs to the assembly. The assembly wants it back. They're concerned that there could actually be a slave revolt, and they want all of this gunpowder back. And at the same time that all of this is happening, there's actually a militia muster taking place up around Fredericksburg. And Patrick Henry is there. So he's going to get these guys whipped up into a frenzy, and they find out while they're up there around Fredericksburg about the battles at Lexington and Concord. So now they're in an absolute frenzy, and he's going to march these guys down to Williamsburg and tell Dunmore to give that powder back. And fortunately, cooler heads prevailed before Patrick Henry made it into the capital, and they encamp up in New Kent. And I think it's actually Peyton Randolph himself who gets things to calm down a little bit. And they basically get Dunmore to write a check for about 300 pounds, which is a substantial amount of money. It's probably more than what the powder was actually worth, but it's not worth the paper it's written on. He's writing them a check that will mean nothing, and he knows that, and so do they, but at least it keeps things from blowing up at this point. At the same time, he also signs a proclamation declaring Patrick Henry an outlaw. So he's going to take action against Patrick Henry at the same time he's trying to placate everybody. And what we're looking at, this image, is the inside of the governor's palace. Those are Brown Bess muskets like this one. So not only do you have all these weapons in the magazine, but they are literally wallpapering the governor's palace because this is a sign of the power that exists in Virginia. So lots and lots of broadswords, and these Brown Bess muskets line the walls of the governor's house. By June, Lord Dunmore is really concerned about the situation in Virginia, and he decides to withdraw from the capital, and he takes his family down Queens Creek to the York River, and he goes aboard the HMS Bowie, tied up at Yorktown, which is the most powerful warship in Virginia at the time. It's a frigate, probably around 28 to 32 guns. Conflicting sources on that number, so I usually go with the smaller one on this ship. But it's a big frigate that has heavy guns on it, and nobody in their right mind would attack this ship because it has enough firepower to level any town in Virginia, including if they could get close enough to Williamsburg, and they can't, but if they could get close enough to Williamsburg, they could just level the whole town. So this is a very powerful ship that he's gone aboard. And now he is going to try to govern Virginia from the deck of this ship. After he's withdrawn from Williamsburg, the militia moves into Williamsburg and encamps there. They loot all of these weapons off the walls of the governor's house. They take whatever's left in the powder magazine and they distribute it to the people that don't have weapons. Now, the militia regulations say you're supposed to have that weapon and all the stuff that goes with it, but down here on the coast, they don't always follow those rules. In the Piedmont, it's a little bit better, and when you get closer and closer to the frontier, everybody has a gun. But down here on the coast, they rely on the presence of the Royal Navy and all that land between them and the French coming down from Canada or the Spanish coming up from Florida or the native people that might make incursions into the colony. So they're protected by distance and the Royal Navy. There's not enough weapons. So they are handing these things out to anybody that needs them. Now we come back to those hunting shirts. So a lot of the guys living in Williamsburg during the summer are going to start referring to these guys as the shirt men. And there's lots of nasty excerpts about them printed in the newspaper or in letters sent to family back in Britain, talking about how these shirt men have occupied the capital of Virginia, as Williamsburg is still the capital at this point, with their long knives and their hunting rifles and their white-tailed deer tails that they put in their hats. And one of them, and I think I have that excerpt up here, even refers to these guys as assassins. A lot of them have axes or tomahawks in their belts. So these guys are frontiersmen. They live out in the woods. They live in the Piedmont. They're kind of a rough group. But this outfit that they're wearing is going to very quickly become a fashion craze. And by the end of the summer, every stitch of available fabric is being turned into hunting shirts like this one. And I couldn't find it to put it into this program, but there was a note in one of the Virginia Gazettes that said, for love or money, you could not find a buck's tail in coastal Virginia because every single one that was available had already been harvested, and everybody was putting them in their hats like these frontiersmen. So this becomes a fashion craze, and yes, some of them were purple. They would dye these things in wild colors. Sometimes these are referred to as blue in the period accounts. So sometimes if you read anything that talks about the Virginia blue hunting shirt, maybe this kind of purpley shade, or sometimes it's a blue similar to this one, which comes from indigo. But either way, they have some wild colors, including green and orange and lots of colors. Because they're not trying to hide in the woods. This is becoming a fashion statement. And even so, deer are colorblind. So it's not really going to matter too much. But these hunting shirts really take off. And the same thing happens when these guys go up to Boston. Because during the summer of '75, while the militia is occupying Williamsburg, we see the first troops from Virginia go up to Boston with George Washington. And that includes around 500 riflemen with Daniel Morgan, the same guys that I had in this image back here. So you've got all these riflemen up around Boston who are causing the same fashion craze in New England. Thing is, they don't make as many hunting shirts up there. This is a very foreign thing to them. At least some of the people living in coastal Virginia had seen somebody wearing a hunting shirt before. In New England, nobody had ever seen this before. This is not something that they wear up there. This is in the backcountry of Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, and you don't see it anywhere else. So this really does cause a fashion stir. And, I forgot to mention this, it is said, and we really don't have any solid confirmation of this. So this is kind of one of those rumors that was circulating at the time. Some of them either printed or embroidered Patrick Henry's slogan from his speech back in March, liberty or death, on the front of their shirt in some way, and that'll come back up again later too. So the Loyalist fleet that's growing out in the York River and the Chesapeake Bay, they are going to start to face some problems because when you're living on a ship, you got to stay fed. And you've got very limited supplies. Most of it is either salted or dried. It's not very tasty. It's meant to get you across the Atlantic Ocean, not have you on constant patrol in the Chesapeake Bay. So to deal with this problem, Lord Dunmore and Captain Matthew Squire, who's the ranking naval officer for most of this time period, they start sending out raiding parties, trying to identify the rebel families, the guys that are taking up arms or at least railing against Lord Dunmore and the Crown, and raid their farms first. They are taking away anything that the fleet might be able to use. Boats, ropes, sails, any kind of canvas that they can find, any supplies that would be useful for ships out in the Chesapeake Bay, and then lots and lots of food. The farms around here produce a lot of cattle, a lot of pork, a lot of wheat, and a lot of corn for the trade to the Caribbean. Down in the islands, they only grow one thing, and that's sugar cane. So if you want food on the Caribbean islands, you have to get it from somewhere else. So that's where most of the food is coming from, is up here in coastal Virginia or other coastal parts of the mainland colonies. That means there's plenty of food for these sailors to take as well. And so they are raiding farms, taking food and other supplies to keep themselves fed out on this growing fleet. By the end of the summer, Lord Dunmore loads his family up aboard the same ship that had been involved in the gunpowder incident, the schooner HMS Magdalen, and sends them back home to Scotland. He's going to stay because it's his job, but he wants his family out of the way. And I'm sure that there were families of other officers and people of rank here in Virginia who were sending their families home as well. Don't know if they all went on the same ship, but anybody who had the means here to get their families out of harm's way was probably doing it. By the end of the summer, there are newspaper articles, just like the excerpts we've looked at already, that are pointing out how much the British raids are affecting local farms. And you're starting to see this tit for tat going on in the papers. You'll see a letter that's sent to a local committee by Dunmore or Squire or some other naval officer, and then you'll see the response from the local committee being published as well. And we start to see this really play out in the newspapers, which is where I've been able to get a lot of the information that you're going to see in this presentation here, because it's all out in the open. It's all being published in the Virginia Gazettes. Now, another really important thing happens in the summer of '75. Sometime in July, a local waterman from down here in Hampton, a guy named Joseph Harris, who is an enslaved harbor pilot. He knows the waters of Hampton Roads better than anybody else. There are pilots like Joseph Harris that go out and meet merchant ships and naval vessels as they come into the Chesapeake Bay or lead them out of the Chesapeake Bay to make sure that they don't run aground anywhere. The average depth of the Chesapeake Bay is a lot less than the average depth of these ships. So it's really easy for them to end up run aground somewhere, and pilots like Joseph Harris, that's their job. And this means that he has access to a boat. We don't know if he owned it or if it belonged to his enslaver, but he has access to a boat. He goes out, meets up with a ship on its way in or on its way out, goes aboard that ship, takes command of it. So let's stop and think about that for a minute. A naval vessel that may have 700 people on board and an admiral is going to turn over control of that vessel to a harbor pilot, and in a lot of cases around here, that's going to be an enslaved man. So that's kind of an unusual situation to be seeing in most in the colonies. But he knows the waters, he has access to a boat. Sometime in July, he escapes. We think he takes the boat that he normally works on, he goes around Hampton up the York River, and he approaches the fleet and says, "I'm a harbor pilot. Would you like me to work with you?" And of course, they would love to have trained harbor pilots with them as they navigate the waters of the Chesapeake Bay, trying to raid farms and not get stuck anywhere. And so they take him on, and word spreads very quickly. If you're enslaved to one of these rebel families and you come offer up your services to Dunmore, they'll take you and give you some kind of protection. So you're going to start to see the number of these folks increase as we get into the fall. And we also see this play out in the newspapers. Now, this is the same newspaper clip that I showed you a little while ago. I haven't had time to track down one that actually has one of these excerpts in it, but we see exchanges going on talking about the growing number of enslaved people that are running away to join the British fleet in the Chesapeake Bay. And eventually they will be called black loyalists. That's the term that we typically use today to refer to these folks. And Dunmore, as far as we can tell, is only taking those people who are enslaved to rebel families. If you're a loyalist, if you're a white loyalist, the people you enslave are untouchable as far as Dunmore is concerned. But if you're in rebellion, fair game. So that's kind of the way this is playing out right now. In September, the beginning of September, there's a storm, possibly a hurricane. We just know it was really bad. Hits the Chesapeake Bay, pushes a bunch of ships up on land in various spots. One of them, a fairly small ship, not even a ship, a tender, some sort of oversized sailboat, which was out probably on one of these raiding missions, runs aground on Back River. So that's over by where Langley is. And the white folks of Hampton go and attack the ship and take everything off of it, and then they burn it. I say attack. By the time they get there, it's been abandoned. Joseph Harris himself is on that boat with Matthew Squire, the commanding naval officer in the Chesapeake Bay. Two of the most hated people, probably the second and third most hated people in Virginia after Lord Dunmore himself, are on that boat. They managed to escape. Based on what we can tell, they make it over to the Hampton River, which is the one right outside here. They steal a small boat and they row down the Hampton River, get out into the Chesapeake Bay, and get picked up by a Navy ship. Several other members of their group get captured. Two of them are black loyalists. They will be re-enslaved. So they're also trying to lay out the consequences. If you become a black loyalist and you join Dunmore, this is what's going to happen to you if we catch you. And we start to see the tensions build more and more and more over property rights. Does it belong to the farmers? Does it belong to the crown? Does it belong to the assembly? That really plays a big role in all of this stuff going on right now. And finally, after the Liberty, the small tender is attacked and all this stuff is taken, Matthew Squire and Lord Dunmore send a letter to the Hampton Committee of Safety, that's their local government here, that says, that stuff belongs to the crown. You need to give it back. If you're going to raise a stink over us taking stuff that belongs to the assembly or to the farmers, well, then that belonged to the crown, so you need to give it back. And they don't do it. And they publish a letter that says, if you give us back our property, we'll give you back your property. And at this point, it's about livestock that's already gone and people who had been enslaved on their farms and plantations. So property rights. That's what this fight is really going to be about at this point, and who has control over what things here in Virginia, or who controls what people. And so the tensions are building. Finally, towards the end of October, just a couple of weeks ago from today, Matthew Squire assembles a small flotilla of schooners like the Magdalen. Magdalen's gone, but schooners like it that have some light artillery on board. And probably something like 150 to 200 people. And this will be a mix of sailors in the Royal Navy, probably some loyalist Marines who would be wearing red coats, probably some members of the 14th Regiment of Foot, which is the only British regiment here in Virginia, and it's only a partial regiment. So he's taking whatever fighting people he can get, and there's actually a few women that we know of on these ships, which is not an uncommon thing. Modern myth that you never had women on ships. So there's a mix of people on these ships, and they are supposed to come up to Hampton and either take back, shoot it off of the Liberty, or bombard the town. Now, they don't have heavy guns like these frigates, but even the little 3 and 4 pounders that have a shot about the size of a baseball, that'll blow right through several houses, and if you hit them in the right spot, you can knock parts of those houses in. You hit a brick fireplace, boom. So you have the ability, even with light artillery, to do some significant damage to the town, and if you can damage some of the buildings and drive enough of the people away, well, then you can start throwing torches into these buildings and set them on fire. And you can just completely remove this poor town that has been defying the Crown and the Royal Navy. So that's their intention. They get to the mouth of the Hampton River on Friday, October 25th, 1775, and the Patriots have sunk 2 small ships at the mouth of the river. Now, it's only partially blocking. There's this long piece of wood that comes off the front of your ship called the bowsprit, so that really long beam that's sticking off the front, and even on small ships you still have that because it helps you get the sails stretched out in front of your boat. They're kind of meeting in the middle of the Hampton River. Hampton River is not that big, but you can't sail through it. If you run into those timbers, they're stout enough that it's going to rip open the sides of your ship. And so they're stuck. They have to stay there. Well, there are about 100 members of the independent companies that have encamped down here in Hampton. As soon as they stole that stuff off of the Liberty, and then they got this strongly worded letter from Squire and Dunmore saying, give that stuff back, the local committee asked the people up in Williamsburg to send troops down. So 100 volunteers had come down and camped out in Hampton right after the Liberty was attacked. They turn out on the shores of the Hampton River down at the mouth, armed with muskets and rifles, and the ships are close enough that they can actually keep them from fighting. If you're going to work the artillery, you have to stand up. You cannot work the artillery crouched down like this. You have to be able to stand up and pull on the ropes that will run the cannons in and out of the side of the ship. You have to be able to reach the muzzle to load it. You have to run your ramrods down the muzzle of the gun. You have to be able to stand up and move around in order to fight on board these ships. You got to be able to put guys up in the rigging armed with muskets. Well, you're close enough to shore that these guys standing on the beach can shoot you if you do that. And so they have a standoff for most of the day. At one point, the American forces, and we think there's about 50 of them, so about half of them have come down to the shores of the river. they withdraw into the trees and try to trick the British into landing, and then they're going to ambush them and come swarming out of the trees, and they don't bite. They're not foolish. They know what they're doing. And so that fails. And then finally around 5 o'clock in the evening, so it's just starting to get dark outside, the American forces withdraw. They come back up here to Hampton, the mouth of the river, about a mile and a half or so. So they come back up here, and now the British actually do burn Cooper's Farm at the mouth of the Hampton River, and we have some artifacts from Cooper's Farm in the exhibit upstairs that were actually given to us weeks ago. Those are brand new artifacts that we've just gotten into our collection. But they burn Cooper's Farm, and then they send a bunch of guys climbing up onto these two ships that had been beached in the middle of the river. They cut through the bowsprits, and now they've cleared the way. Not going to try to come up in the dark, but they've made room for it. And as all of this is happening, the local militia commander sends an express rider tearing up the road to Williamsburg on horseback to ask for reinforcements. And overnight in a rainstorm, which just again goes to show how tough these frontiersmen are, about 50 of them ride down through the rain overnight to get to Hampton. It's about 25, 30 miles, and they are here by 7 o'clock the following morning with the commanding military officer in Virginia, Colonel William Woodford. So now you've got the commanding officer of the Royal Navy, Matthew Squire, and the commanding officer of the Virginia forces, William Woodford, right here in Hampton together, squaring off. So the following morning, as these guys ride into town, Woodford drops them off at the church, which is right across the street from us, and they go, and he goes off to join Miles Carey, who's the local militia commander, for breakfast, and the shooting starts. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But in order to understand what happens during this fighting, we're going to have to take a moment to explain the differences between this weapon and the one at the bottom of the screen. So what I'm holding here is a Brown Bess musket. This would have been the standard military weapon for the British Army and kind of the British Navy. They have a slightly different version of this, but it's basically the same gun. So this is what the British Army and Navy are using. This is also what was all over the walls of Dunmore's Palace. This is in the magazine at Williamsburg. This is probably the most common firearm in Virginia at the time. And then you've got these hunting rifles. Now, with a musket, the inside of the barrel is smooth, like a shotgun. And in fact, this is about the same size as a 12-gauge shotgun. It's about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So it's a very big gun. You are carrying a box like this one on your hip. Each of those little holes in the wooden block holds a single gunpowder cartridge, so a paper tube full of gunpowder with the bullet tied to the end of it, and that's how you load this gun. You tear open the paper, you pour a little bit of powder into the priming pan on the side of the gun, you close it, you drop it down to the ground, you take the rest of the powder, pour it down the barrel, and then stuff the bullet with the paper wrapped around it. You pull out the ramrod, turn it over, pack everything in, put the ramrod back underneath, then you can actually fire the weapon. Lots of steps involved. British Army can do this in about 15 seconds. For some of the better regiments, they can get closer to 10 seconds to go through all those steps. So a very powerful weapon in the hands of people that know how to use it. Fire a lot of rounds downrange on the battlefield. That hunting rifle has the same parts, but the inside of it has spiral grooves. Means you can't really get the same accuracy out of it if you load it with a paper cartridge. So you don't have a cartridge box, you have a powder horn with loose powder, you've got a bag full of bullets, and you've got cloth patches. So what they do now is you start by taking a little bit of the powder out of the horn and tapping it into the pan and closing the pan. Then you're going to drop your rifle down to the ground, and you got to cradle it, because now you have to take the little cup that hangs off of your belt, and you've got to fill that measuring cup up with gunpowder. You have to have the right amount. Not enough, bullet doesn't come out. Too much, it blows up. So you have to measure the gunpowder, pour that down, make sure that your powder horn is capped again, because if a spark gets in there, you're wearing a grenade on your belt. So you got to make sure that that's capped off again. Now you reach into your hunting pouch, you pull out a patch and a round ball, you put the patch over the end, You put the ball on it, and then you push it down into the barrel, and it's going to be tight because that's what gets it to grab those spiral grooves inside and spin like a football. And that's what gives you the accuracy of that weapon. Well, because it fits tight, you can't just push everything down. That paper-wrapped ball slides right down the smooth barrel. You have to slowly push it down a few inches at a time with the wooden ramrod. If you grab it up in the middle and you try, you're going to snap the thing in half. So you have to go slow. It can take you over a minute to load that rifle, whereas this can be reloaded in about 10 or 15 seconds. So significant difference in how they are loaded and how long it takes. This can hit somebody at about 100 yards, maybe a little bit further. That rifle, maybe out to 300 yards. And so of course. And so those rifles can shoot out to about 250, 300 yards if you've got guys that know what they're doing. Battle of Hampton, the morning these ships start to come up the river, if you go down to the waterfront after you leave the museum today and look across the Hampton River, at its widest points, it's about 300 yards maybe. So they are well within range of these riflemen, and if you're standing on the deck of that ship trying to work the artillery, they have half of your body to shoot at. Most of these guys can hit something that size at 200 yards or more, and you're closer than that. And even the guys armed with muskets, if those ships get too close to shore, even they can hit you with this thing. Well, that's going to be a big problem for the British ships. So they come up the river. By about 7:30, they start to fire on the town. They get off maybe 1 or 2 shots with the artillery. And then there is such a stout suppressive fire coming from the militia that they can't stand up and fight anymore. So for several hours, they are basically just pinned down on the decks of their ships, trying not to get shot, unable to maneuver or do anything. And then finally, they start putting guys down the leeward side, so the opposite side of the river, protected by the entire hull of their ship. They tie the boats onto their ships. They start cutting their anchor cables, and they're going to tow themselves back down the river with rowboats to escape. So the Battle of Hampton, which started the day before, so it's kind of a 2-day affair, is going to end by midday with a British defeat as they are chased down the river by a bunch of guys armed with rifles and muskets, and these ships that have heavy guns on them can't do anything to stop the militia. And so it's going to be a Patriot victory. They reacted a little too slowly to the British escape. If they had sent a party down to the mouth of the river where it's only like 100 yards wide, they probably could have stopped them from escaping at all and captured all 5 of their boats. As it is, the smaller ones got too close to shore and it was captured. We think right here on this side of the river, just a couple 100 yards from here, they got so close that a bunch of these militia guys are able to walk out in the water and grab the boat and pull it up on shore. Yeah. According to Matthew Squire, the commander of that vessel, Lieutenant Hawke, was a rash man. And I think that's probably right, to have gotten that close. And so the weapons that are here do have a role in what happened during the Battle of Hampton. But they were so close to shore that even if they hadn't had a single rifle, they probably still would have been able to prevail over them. And here's another. This is one of our very few period images of a rifleman. And this was done in 77 or 78. But it shows one of these riflemen, and on his powder horn we see, or maybe it's the flap of his hunting pouch, we're not sure, it says liberty or death. So there we have direct evidence of somebody actually printing the slogan on a piece of their equipment. Maybe these guys did that in the lead up to the Battle of Hampton. So maybe as many as 400 people here, about 100 regular infantry, the 50 guys who came down overnight, and then maybe another 50 or 100 local militia. So 200, maybe 250 militiamen on the Virginia side, and maybe 200, probably a little bit less than that, on the British side during the battle. Now, a few days after the Battle of Hampton, Lord Dunmore makes what's been going on throughout the summer with the support of black loyalists a formal proclamation that he is publishing with a printing press that he took out of a printing shop in Norfolk. And so he has literally written this thing out and gotten a printer to make broadsides. They are printing large posters that they can then distribute throughout coastal Virginia that says, if you are enslaved to a rebel family and you join the British, you will get your freedom at the end of the conflict no matter what happens. So this is a promise of freedom, permanent freedom, if you join the British, regardless of the final outcome. And this is distributed pretty widely, and it enrages a lot of the white plantation owners around here who are on the rebel side. So they're talking about it, and it's published in the newspaper, and there's lots of discussion about it. And so we know that this proclamation caused a big stir. It also opens the floodgates. At first, the black loyalists joining Dunmore are the ones who are willing to take a greater risk and get out to that fleet without the actual promise. They could just get turned around and sent back. Following the publication of the proclamation, now they know that if they come to the British, they will get their freedom. Within a couple of weeks, there are so many black loyalists with Lord Dunmore that he is able to supplement his very small number of British soldiers by creating the Ethiopian Regiment. So an Ethiopian in the 18th century is the most respectful way the British would describe somebody of African descent. So most of these guys were probably not from Ethiopia. Most of them would have, their ancestors would have come from Western Africa for the most part, but they will be called the Ethiopian Regiment as a sign of respect for them at the time. And they'll basically be an extension of the 14th Regiment of Foot. And so the guy we see up here, I can't get rid of this little box, but I can move it. Let's try that. I tried that. It's not doing it. Yeah, it's not doing it. So the guy in the red coat is probably a recruiter. It was pretty common in the British Army for them to get a guy who was well-dressed to go out and try to recruit people. So he's probably a recruiting sergeant in the Ethiopian Regiment. Most of them will be outfitted with hunting shirts. It's cheap. It's easy to put together. You've got plenty of access to canvas when you're in the Navy. And he's got all these ships with him. They've been looting lots of canvas. So they are going to outfit these guys in hunting shirts, and they might have printed "Liberty to Slaves" on the front of their shirts as a counter to Patrick Henry's slogan being printed on the other shirts. Now, again, we really haven't been able to verify this, so it's something that there's kind of hearsay about at the time. It would be very powerful messaging, especially since most of the enslaved Africans or African Virginians in this colony probably couldn't read. So who's the message actually for? It's for their enslavers on the other side of the battlefield. So this is pretty powerful messaging if they did it. I like to think that Dunmore did and that this was a very provocative propaganda piece, but we don't know for sure. Now, the Ethiopian Regiment is going to be 500 men. That's more than the total number of 14th Regiment of Foot guys that Dunmore has. He has something like 200 infantry and a handful of cavalry and artillerymen. So the total number of British troops here is probably around 300. He has more members of the Ethiopian Regiment than he does the actual red-coated British troops. So he has more than doubled his fighting force by doing this. And by the end of the year, there's going to be a battle that includes these men down at Great Bridge in what's now Virginia Beach, Chesapeake. So by the end of the year, these guys are actually going to be involved in combat. Now, like the Battle of Hampton, the Battle of Great Bridge will be an American victory, so the Ethiopian Regiment doesn't play a huge role in it, and there was some confusion on the battlefield. But the important thing for us is that this is the first black regiment in the British Army. And there will be a lot more in the future. This is the first time they ever did that. And it proved that it was functional. This is also going to be part of the reason that the Rhode Island Regiment, made up of freed men in Rhode Island, will exist on the American side. And Washington even writes letters that say, I don't know if I can counter this. He didn't want to have any black men at arms in the Continental Army at all, but then he's kind of pressured into it. And so this might be a good source, or it is a big part of the reason that the Rhode Island Regiment is created later on. And so Will, do you know how to get rid of this box? All right, thank you. So these are some of the legacies that come out of this, and at this point we've run a little bit long, so we're going to switch to answering any questions that you folks have. Not too bad, I only went 5 minutes over. You know, that's good for me. So if you folks have questions about anything, please let me know, and you'll see some of the same things that I've just talked about in our exhibit on the floor. Now, the exhibit isn't just about the Battle of Hampton. It really shows what Hampton's role was throughout the Revolution. It includes a section about the Battle of Hampton, some of the lead up to it, but it also has a lot more about the economic changes that were happening here, because Hampton is still going to be a port, and it will also become the headquarters for the Virginia Navy during the American Revolution. So, yes?
Where was the Cooper farm? Like, was it where Merrimack Shores?
Yes. Yes, Blackbeard's Point or Merrimack Shores is where Edward Cooper's farm was. So it's on the west side of the Hampton River. We actually have it marked on one of the maps upstairs. And that is the only thing in this area that they seem to have destroyed. Now, the day before the battle, they conducted some raids up Mill Creek over by Point Comfort, where Fort Monroe sits now. They don't seem to have destroyed anything. They raided some of the farms there. They probably took some stuff. They may have freed or emancipated a couple of the enslaved Africans that were there along the way. We don't have good details on what happened on Mill Creek other than some raids. They don't seem to have destroyed anything. So Edward Cooper's farm seems to be the only thing here that really faces that kind of destruction. They get off 1 or 2 artillery rounds at the beginning of the battle here in the river before they are under such suppressive fire they can't shoot anymore. According to the newspaper accounts, a cannonball blew through somebody's door, and that was the only damage to the town itself. We don't have really good data, a breakdown of that. Let's say it's around 50%. So if we go back to my demographic information from the very beginning, there are around 220 enslaved people in Virginia, so let's say roughly half of that will be male and half of it will be female, approximately. Yes, sir?
How many Africans joined the Continental groups from Virginia and Florida?
I don't know. That's not something that I've researched enough at this point. There will be some African American involvement in the Continental Army from Virginia and the Virginia regiments. It will not be significant. It will be a small number, that I can say. Most of the African American involvement in the Continental Army is going to come from New England. The Rhode Island Regiment will be the largest group by far, but in most of the other regiments, they'll just kind of be integrated, or there'll be one like company that would be African American. So it's not going to be huge numbers. Yes?
On a previous slide, you had mentioned that the white enslaved people were not allowed to be part of that freedom that the British were offering. So it brings to question, how many of the enslaved people were white?
None.
How many?
0. There are no enslaved white people in Virginia. That's
They didn't include indentured servitude as well?
So there are some indentured servants in Virginia at this point. The number of indentured servants is quite small. And at this point, most of the indentures will be people who are involved in a trade. So they're apprentices for the most part. You see a pretty drastic shift taking place throughout the 17th century. So if we you see mostly indentured servants doing farm labor. By the 1650s, you start to see the transition to more and more Africans. Many of them will be enslaved. By the end of the 17th century, you see the tipping point where most of the labor will be enslaved Africans with some white indentured servants. By the middle of the 18th century, most of the white indentures that are here will be involved in a trade, and there'll be something more like an apprentice. And then by the Revolution, the number of white indentures is very, very low because slave labor had been so effective for the people who could afford it that they purchase enough enslaved people that they then rent them out to other farmers. That becomes the number one labor source in coastal Virginia and in the Piedmont. Probably by the 1740s, you would have seen that really established here.
I was wondering why the comment was made about no white enslaved
because there just weren't any. I mean, the indentured servants that are here, they don't get to vote, and they're still expected to be part of the militia. So even if you are indentured here, being able to vote for a representative in the assembly, for that you must be a landowner. However, being in the militia is every white man between 16 and 17. They didn't care what your legal status was, whether you were indentured free. They didn't care if you were a plantation owner. Most of the people with means would have been officers in the militia companies, but you're still expected to be part of that militia system. And the social order in Britain, most of the officers in the British Army are members of the gentry. Here, there is no nobility. So it'll be more economically centered, and the gentry here is based on how wealthy you are more than anything else. So you do see a different system develop in the colonies from what you see at home, because there's just no nobility here. The only noblemen that are in Virginia are sent here to be governors, or they are landowners who already had title at home, but that title doesn't mean anything here in Virginia. So very different social system, very different economic system on this side of the Atlantic. Anybody else?
You mentioned something about, I think it was the troops coming down from Williamsburg and dropped them at the church.
Yes, so St. John's Church. Yeah, because they'd ridden down overnight in the rain, he wanted them to go inside and get dried off. So they probably tied up their horses outside, and then they went into the building to try to get dried off. Now, almost immediately, like within a half an hour of these guys arriving at the church, probably less than that, the first shots are fired, and they're all going to go running down to the waterfront. But that was why he dropped them off there, because they're all soaking wet, and he needs them to get dried off and ready for a fight if there is one. They did not treat churches in quite the same way that we do, like even in the federal period following the Revolution. There are plenty of occasions where churches are used as stables. It is a big open building, and if you pews around, most of the time they are not anchored to the floor, you can do a lot in that building. So there are lots of occasions during the Revolutionary War where both American and British forces are using churches as barracks or as stables or other buildings, storehouses sometimes. So they did not treat it with the same kind of reverence that you would see in most churches today. All right. Well, thank you for listening to me. The exhibit is on the second floor that deals with the Revolution. You're also going to find folks in the main galleries, for those that have just come in, talking about a bunch of different topics related to this and doing some activities. But please go and enjoy. And if you have questions, I'll be up on the second floor in a little bit. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.